Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, my now 32-year-old husband.
32.
Just crossed over a birthday.
What do they say? 32 is the new 22. So we're going to go with that.
Yeah, sure. I think you tried to make that joke on last week's podcast, too.
I know. Whatever.
Well, I wanted to take today's episode. So I was actually talking with a client recently. So this was a newer client who came into the program. And so she asked me about some food sensitivity testing. And, she was someone who kind of expressed in the past, she's worked with a naturopath and she's dealt with a lot of different symptoms in her body, like anything from skin issues to some more like common digestive issues. And she had recommendations around cutting out a lot of different foods. And so essentially she asked, I would love to just know what exactly I need to cut out. And, would a food sensitivity test, is that something you'd recommend? If so, what kind? And so we had a really good conversation around it, and I'll kind of probably explain some of that as we walk through this episode. But I figured it would be a really good opportunity to bring this to our podcast listeners a little bit and share a little bit of some of the things that I touched on with her, but also just dive a little bit deeper into essentially what are the differences between, food sensitivities versus intolerances versus allergies? How do we kind of test for these things? When do we feel like it might be actually worth testing for these things? Like, what can we do with that? Just kind of answer some of the common questions that come up around this topic.
Yeah, I love it. I think personally, honestly, this is even going to be helpful for me because I like to tell myself that I'm not allergic to anything, but yet again, sometimes I do see some bloating. I do see some stuff that I'm like, I don't know, is it an intolerance? Is it a sensitivity? So let's go ahead and dive in. Yeah. So I guess question number one to start kicking things off for you, Vanessa, break that down. What's the difference between a food sensitivity versus a food intolerance versus a food allergy? And describe that to us if you don't mind.
Yeah. So even as you were kind of just describing there, really essentially we're making a common mistake where a lot of us, we lump them all into the same bucket.
Yeah.
So like you had said, I kind of tell myself I don't really have any allergies, but sometimes I notice bloating, different things. So that's where we have to get very clear on the language that we're using of what is a food allergy versus an intolerance versus a sensitivity, because they're very, very different. So, we can kind of start with a food allergy essentially. This would be, if you think about when you were going to school, you maybe had different kids that were in your classes, different things that had what is a very common allergy. No, they had a very common allergy, which is a peanut allergy, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so think about it, those types of, a lot of times it's other students in your class, they couldn't necessarily have even peanuts within the room with them, right? Mm-hmm. Because if they ingested even a small amount of peanuts, they could be at risk of death, because you could have this immediate immune-based reaction that can be fatal, essentially.
Got it.
So food allergies are I would say are the most intense type of kind of reaction that we might have to foods. These are immune reactions. So these are essentially what is called an IgE immune reaction to foods. So essentially your body's immune system is really just identifying this specific type of food as an invader in the body. And it's going to react by trying to protect you, right? So it's going to produce these antibodies to try and protect you. And so these will be very, very quick onset reactions. As soon as you ingest this food, it can happen immediately. Where now, throat is closing up. Now,
this is the serious one where people they need the EpiPen sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So typically this would be throat closing up, difficulty breathing. Those are the more intense things that can be fatal.
Yeah.
But it can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be something like that. Some people will notice my tongue just swells up a little bit, or I get this funny itchiness, or maybe I break out in hives. But these are going to happen, within seconds to at most hours.
Interesting. Okay. I definitely don't think I have any allergies, because I was the kid that if somebody did have a food allergy and they were yeah, I can't have that cookie, but yeah, I'll take it. I'll take your peanut butter cookie.
Yeah. So that's allergies. So really there's, kind of 8 most common allergens when it comes to food. So the 8 are milk, eggs, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soy.
Okay.
So those are common allergens. So typically, people as they get into adult life, they're probably already aware if they have an allergy to a food.
So
like
if
that.
food allergy is the most, serious, not serious.
I guess we could say most intense.
Most intense. What would be the next one?
Yeah, so then I would say a food intolerance is, so now we can, again, we're talking about our 3 different buckets here. So we covered allergies. Now we all know what that is. So what are our other 2 kind of like options that we could use for terms would be a food intolerance and a food sensitivity. So let's start with food intolerances. So an intolerance is essentially, it's going to be really isolated to the digestive tract. And what's happening when we talk about intolerance is think lactose intolerance, right?
Okay.
A lot of people say, I have lactose intolerance. So what does that actually mean? It means that their body is not producing the enzyme that they need to break down that food.
Got it.
So lactose intolerance specifically would be that you're not producing the lactase enzyme, or at least not producing enough of the lactase enzyme to break down lactose. So you are intolerant to lactose.
Okay. So at this point, you're not breaking out in hives. Like you don't need, throat's not closing. It's just more so, again, your body just doesn't have the adequate enzymes to be able to break that type of food down.
You're going to end up with tummy issues, essentially, because you're not breaking that food down properly.
Okay.
So that's an intolerance. So now food sensitivity. This is what people are most commonly referring to, whether they say, intolerance, allergy, sensitivity, like this is what people are typically thinking of. So food sensitivities, these are more of like a chronic low-grade inflammation. And they are, so it's an immune reaction. So these are being caused by these immune-mediated reactors, essentially, called mediators. So think histamines, cytokines. It's an immune-based reaction.
Okay.
But unlike allergies are that, again, remember that very quick onset reaction from the immune system really protecting you. The thing about intolerances and this type of immune-based reaction is it can happen from 45 minutes to 3 days later.
Dang, 3 days later. Wow.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's why sensitivities are really hard to detect. They're really hard to figure out because you might not have this reaction until 3 days later. And so 3 days later, it's really tough to be like, oh, okay, like I'm noticing myself being a little bit more bloated. Is it because of, the eggs that I ate 45 minutes ago? Or is it because of the yogurt I had 3 days ago?
Or is it because of like the pizza and beer that I had on Saturday night and it's Tuesday? No, but seriously, think about it that way, right? Because I think a lot of people like fall off track on the weekends and then come Monday, Tuesday, they're like, oh my gosh, it was my eggs that I had this morning, but really it was like what we had 3 days ago.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. And so the other, challenge when it comes to food sensitivities isn't just the timeline of the reactions, but it's also like the types of reactions we have from these things. So
what does that mean?
Like, again, think allergies. They're pretty easy to detect because it's like, oh my gosh, my throat is closing up. That food, clearly I'm allergic to it. Now, a sensitivity, it might mean, like common like digestive things. Like it might mean you're more bloated. It might mean that you just are having like different digestive symptoms, maybe constipation or diarrhea, but it also could be brain fog. It could be skin issues. Like now we're kind of breaking out. Now we're having a little bit more like, maybe more like almost even eczema type reactions. It could be sinus issues. It could be brain fog. Like there's a myriad of different symptoms that can kind of occur from these types of reactions, which again makes it incredibly difficult to actually detect. Do you have a food sensitivity A? And if so, what food are you sensitive to?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, no, that's hard to, so I guess if somebody were to like, how would you like describe it? Like give me a more like in-depth overview of like what a food sensitivity is, just so, because you're right. If it can happen between a couple 45 minutes to 3 days, and it can be a myriad of like symptoms, like how the heck do you describe something like this?
Yeah. So one way I like to think about this was an analogy I heard once. So imagine like your gut, remember, is going to be a little bit permeable, meaning that things can seep through it. However, like your gut lining should be more like nylon stockings than fishnet stockings.
Okay.
So think like nylon tights are, you're going to be They are permeable. Like if you...
What are those like shiny leather ones? Are those nylon? You know what I'm talking about?
Leather is not going to be...
All right, now we're
You don't want your gut lining to be like leather, no.
Like black leather that the girls wear. Okay, so nylon.
Think like women in wintertime wearing a dress might have some nylon stockings on.
Okay. Got it.
So picture like a little girl in her little Christmas outfit wearing her little nylon stockings.
There was a cartoon, it was like Madeline or whatever. But anyways, go ahead. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, like the gut, again, it should be semi-permeable, meaning that nutrients can cross over that barrier of the gut lining, but it shouldn't be like food crossing through.
Okay.
You should have food at this point really, you're adequately breaking things down through the digestive tract. You have those enzymes that are actually like breaking everything down. And then essentially within the gut, you should be allowing the nutrients and the water to be able to cross through. So imagine if you like literally had some nylon stockings and you put some food in, like you dumped your food inside, the whole food itself should not fall through the nylon stockings. You're not going to have crumbles of food falling through, but you would have, the water and the actually like little tiny nutrient particles would be crossing through, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you had a pair of fishnet stockings and you dumped the same food in, you'd have particles of that food falling through the holes of the fishnet stockings.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's essentially kind of like can help you picture what it might look like when we're talking about like a healthy gut versus a gut that's going to be more prone to that type of inflammation. You're essentially letting these larger pieces of food kind of escape through that gut barrier when it shouldn't be escaping through.
Got it. So you're saying a gut lining that isn't as healthy is more like fishnet stockings, that it does allow particles of food and heavier things to kind of go
Exactly. So like the gut has these tight junctions essentially within the gut. So those junctions, they're going to be essentially like pulling apart to kind of letting things through as they need to.
It's like a filtration system.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to describe it.
Thanks.
But we don't want food that isn't getting digested properly to be able to push through those tight junctions and end up where they're not supposed to end up. And that's what happens is now you might have food ending up where it's not supposed to be ending up. So what happens is your body's like, oh, this is not where it's supposed to be. So we need to send the guards in, right? So think of like your body's guards are going to be these mediators that I kind of referred to before. So these immune-based mediators. So these are going to be IgE, IgG, IgM, different types of cytokines, things like that. So we're getting a little sciencey
and these
here,
are
but hang with
the
me.
guards that are supposed to be, keeping things in order, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. You could also think of these as like basically the guns that are going to be attacking these particles that shouldn't be there.
Breaking them down. Okay.
Yeah. So the way I like to, or the reason I like to even think of it as more than just a guard, but actually the gun itself, is because now it's basically like firing off at the food that's ended up in the wrong place, right? And what a food sensitivity test does is it's looking at what guns are essentially present in your system. But the best types of food sensitivity tests aren't just looking at, okay, we have these guns firing off. It's looking at how many bullets are they firing, which is going to help you kind of understand like the extent of the inflammation that's taking place, essentially.
Got it. And I can imagine like certain guards or guns, whatever you want to call them, if they're firing more than others, it can tell you better or give you a better idea of kind of what sort of foods are causing the insensitivity.
Yep, exactly.
I'm good. I get this. See, you explain things in guns and
yeah, you're following
and guards,
now.
and I'm like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, so that's kind of how we can tell like if there are food sensitivities present, but also the extent of the sensitivities, because it's not black or white. It's not, oh, we're sensitive to this food, we're not sensitive to that food.
Right.
It's like we all kind of have we all have sensitivities.
Okay.
It's just like the degree of the level of sensitivity and how much that's going to actually affect your body.
It's the dimmer analogy, right? Like if some dimmers are higher than others and you're like, okay, well, we need to focus on this area versus this area and so on and so forth. Okay.
Exactly. And that's why, so like with that client, kind of going back to the beginning here, where she was basically asking of like, should I take a food sensitivity test so I know what foods I should just cut out? It's like, well, like we could go that route, sure. But do we really want to just jump into just cutting out all these foods? The reality is, based on symptoms, we know that there is something going on. But it's likely that we just have some gut things going on. We have some hormone things. We maybe have, some like a liver that's not quite fully, working optimally. It's like there's probably just some different systems that need to be worked on a little bit. And through the process of working on those symptoms, we can go ahead and probably assume that a lot of these sensitivities are going to start to resolve themselves. And long term, we don't want to have to cut out all those foods. That might be something that we might get to at some point, and we can kind of talk about what that like process would be like, if why we would want to go to that point. But the reality is, I don't want my clients to have to cut out all these foods forever. There might be a short period of time, depending on the extent of the gut issues, the extent of the hormone issues, where we might cut things out for a period of time. But the goal is to be able to get your body to bring those things back in without those issues continuing at that point in time.
Got it. Do you think it's fair to say that, I think a lot of times people don't know whether, or I think the easiest thing is just to cut foods out, right? And I think that's where people, like, that's the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's where people tend to do. And they'll cut it out for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, and then they're like, F it, I'm going back to it. Exactly. And then they never truly fix the root problem. But do you think part of it is just because, again, they don't know how to actually go about doing things properly? Or like, why do you think people just go to or resort to cutting foods out?
Yeah, well, I think people get desperate, honestly. Yeah. I think people get desperate to where they're dealing with these essentially symptoms of food sensitivities. And they don't like that feeling. They don't like feeling bloated. They don't like dealing with brain fog. They don't like having the low energy. They
if you're dealing like migraines and all that stuff.
Yeah. So it's like, it makes sense. And so like you might hear something, maybe it's coming from these food sensitivity testing companies themselves that are saying, oh, well, just find out what food is causing you to feel this way and just remove that food, and then you're going to feel better. And it's that simple. Yeah. And it sounds so simple. It sounds like, oh man, just tell me what I shouldn't eat anymore so I don't feel this way anymore. And initially, that sounds like a fantastic idea. But like you said, this is real life where it's hard to just eliminate these common types of foods from your diet forever. Yep. And especially even just like establishing this association of like, oh, that food is bad. That food makes me feel that way. Now, inherently, you're going to start to feel guilty when you do have that food, to where maybe you actually resolve what's really causing that inflammation, to where maybe that food actually doesn't have that reaction to you anymore. But yet, because you have this mental association with like, oh my gosh, that food, that gluten always messes me up. Well, now you have it, and you actually create that response in your body from a point of stress.
Got it. Okay. I mean, the way I look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I always love analogies. I'm a big analogy guy. But now that I'm 32, I'm a little bit wiser.
So wise.
Older. I know. But it's kind of like, we've used the analogy of like a race car first and foremost, right? Fueling it correctly, making sure that it can perform to the best of its ability. But it's like having a road that has potholes in it, and you being like, you know what? That road, it just triggers all of these responses in my car. It can never go down that alleyway, right? As opposed to if we were to just get the bigger tires that it needs so that it can go over the potholes and things would be great, then just fixing it and going from there. Is that kind of what the process is?
Yeah, and that's one way we can look at it for sure.
Thank you. See, I told you I was wiser.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So everything you've mentioned, there's a ton of companies out there, ads. I mean, you get hit with so much stuff. So like how and when would you test for food sensitivities? Like what's the best way to go about this?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So a lot of people, again, it's very alluring, this idea of wanting to just like test and find out what your food sensitivities are. So if that is something that you are really considering, my number one recommendation for a food sensitivity test would be it's what's called an MRT test. So this is the type of food sensitivity test that realistically, I don't think you could get it just as a consumer, because this is more of like what practitioners are going to be using. So like we can order it for our clients, but I don't believe there's anywhere that our clients could go to just order it on their own. And honestly, that right there can also help you distinguish between like quality tests and not so quality tests. It's like if you can order it at home, realistically, it's probably not going to be exactly what you're looking for. It's probably more based around like, just trying to like sell you supplements and sell you extra things. It's taking advantage of you as being the consumer, not being as aware. So that's where a lot of these tests come from.
I mean, it's kind of like having a medication that's over the counter or something that's prescribed to you. It's more generic.
Yeah. That could be one way to think about it. So an MRT food sensitivity test. So this is a test that is essentially measuring the body's inflammatory response to 140 different foods and 30 different food chemicals. So this is an inflammatory response that essentially, when our body encounters this food, encounters this trigger, whatever it is, it's going to release these pro-inflammatory chemicals. And so these chemicals are what's causing this like adverse symptom. So it might be, again, like migraines, headaches, skin issues, cognition issues, so like brain fog, poor memory, things like that. It could be IBS, it could be joint pain, respiratory problems. Like there's a lot of different things that could be happening here from these foods or food chemicals in this reaction in our body. So essentially the MRT test, this has been shown from a lot of different scientific studies that this is considered the most accurate form of food sensitivity testing. So it's a blood test, and it is regarded as probably the most accurate food sensitivity blood test that is available. So the MRT test, it's also really nice because it shows essentially the level of reactivity, not just black and white, reactive, not reactive. And I think that's really helpful because a lot of these types of at-home tests I also see from people are like, oh my gosh, I took this test and it's just like all the things I eat are showing up as reactive. Like, I guess I'm never going to eat these things again. And now they're overwhelmed, they're stressed, they feel restricted. But the reality is we have a lot of our bodies have a lot of different responses to a lot of different foods, but it's not so much of like, oh yes, you have a response, so you shouldn't eat that. It's more of like, to what extent are you having a response? Because if you're having a very low response, it might not be something that really is a problem. It might not need to be cut out at all. But essentially, this test it's really helpful for clients who are maybe dealing with like autoimmune issues, like immune system dysfunction, histamine reactions, like really bad gut inflammation. Like this test can be helpful in these types of situations. It's very, very well researched, very well studied when it comes to clients with like autoimmune conditions like Crohn's, rheumatoid arthritis, like that. It can be very beneficial in those types of situations because essentially it's going to allow you to help bring down these antibodies so that you can feel better. So you're not having quite as many of these kinds of reactions essentially. But when it comes to like more practically, how do we kind of use this when it comes to our clients? We don't turn to this very often. And the reason is because we really like to start with the low-hanging fruit, essentially. So typically a lot of people come to us expressing like, I think I have all these food sensitivities. So once we start looking across the board at the different systems of their body, a lot of times we'll see, well, it looks like gut might be off, looks like hormones are off, looks like liver's a little sluggish. Like I kind of mentioned those three earlier. Mm-hmm. So we'll say, okay, let's start working on these things. Maybe let's start by, whatever for that client, whatever the low-hanging fruit is. So like if they're starting from a place of like, have never tracked their food, have no idea how much they're eating, not really much awareness on what they're eating, their, just lifestyle habits are like non-existent. It's like, hey, let's start with those things, see how we feel. Okay, we've kind of like gotten these things to a good spot. We're, maybe feeling a little bit better, but still noticing a lot of these symptoms. It's like, okay, now let's kind of go that next line. Now let's dive deeper into our hormone and gut. And as we work through these systems of the body and we improve them, like 9 times out of 10, these kind of food sensitivity issues resolve themselves. However, for those people that like, they get to that point where now it's like, okay, still dealing with these issues. My gut feels great. My hormones look great. Like everything's in a great spot, but I'm still having these types of issues. That's when we might say, okay, now let's move to something like an MRT test. But we don't really ever start with an MRT test because also, again, like these types of quality lab tests are relatively expensive. And if we feel like it might be better for somebody to work on their gut health and their hormone health, we might start more with something like putting our money towards a GI map for our gut or a Dutch test for our hormones, rather than jumping to something like an MRT food sensitivity test that's not going to really actually help us understand what might really be causing that inflammation. It's more of just, hey, let's remove these foods that are adding to the inflammation and creating some of this response. But we're not like really at the basic level actually healing, the gut that might, again, be having those like junctions that are allowing these foods through and creating that reaction.
Yeah, I think that's the most frustrating part for anybody out there, myself included, is, the human body is such a puzzle. And like you said, sometimes you might be having these symptoms of sensitivity, allergy, whatever you want to call it, but it's not even because of the things that you're eating. It's because of something else that's triggering another response, that's triggering hormones, guts, that's getting you to these particular issues, right? And it's working backwards. And like you said, sometimes it's better to just fix the bigger problems that are more, present, I guess you can call it. And then, as those bigger problems start to get better, again, it's like a waterfall effect. It trickles down and things end up getting better without you even having to go through any of these things.
Yeah. It's, like just overall with taking a more holistic approach to your health and your body, it can be a little bit more of like a process of elimination, as opposed to like when you go to a doctor, it's very like, ooh, let me slap this label on you of like, oh, you have this symptom, you have that symptom. Okay, this is what you have.
Which is what we hear so often.
Exactly. You have IBS. Here, take this medication, take this thing. And it's just like, okay, now I've done this and maybe I feel a little bit better, but now I have this other issue. Oh, now you have this. Now take this. And it's just kind of like that constant like, okay, we're doing this, now we're doing that.
If you guys are seeing us on the YouTube video here. All right, so last question, because I think you've gotten this one quite a lot, and it's always so interesting to me because there was once upon a time where Vanessa and I, she wasn't eating gluten, she wasn't eating any of these things, and my favorite, not favorite, it's funny now, it wasn't that funny at the time, was when we were in Spain, and anyways, we had to go to 2 different pizza shops just because you had to get your gluten-free pizza.
Yep.
I had to get mine. And that was, at the time, it was a pain in the ass. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, how long is this thing going to go? But now you're in a better place. We just had pizza for my birthday, and I think everything is going in a good place. So my question is, can food sensitivities, are they forever? Can they be resolved? Can they be, improved, I guess?
Yeah. So it's, again, kind of going back to the beginning of like our sensitivities versus intolerances versus allergies. Allergies are forever. You have this allergic reaction. Intolerances are probably also forever. There are other ways, like, you can add, like essentially you can take the enzymes that can help your body kind of process those foods so you can have them in moderation. Sensitivities, it's again, like probably all the talk we've had about sensitivities, it's a little bit more of a complicated answer. The reality is it depends. It does depend. So sometimes no matter how long a food is avoided for, it might still trigger symptoms. So like you could remove that food for a very long time, really heal things, and then add it back in. You still might have some of those symptoms. Maybe they're lesser of symptoms than they used to be. They're not as intense, but you might still have symptoms. Other times, the immune system calms down. And, especially if you go about this the right way, where, again, if we go through that process, we're healing the gut, we're healing the hormones, and we're really getting your body in tip-top shape health-wise. Maybe if we go as far as then adding on MRT test, from there we can do essentially what is called like a LEAP program, which I won't dive super deep into on this podcast because it can get pretty complicated, but that can be a way of essentially gradually building a diet that is something that like the client can then actually like take this phased approach essentially to really understanding like a diet that's going to reduce their symptoms. But that aside, so like, let's say we go through all those steps, you may find then that like now through that phased approach of adding these things back in, you may never have those symptoms anymore. You may not have any sensitivities left from these foods at that point. But it does depend, because immune systems and immune cells, they have memories. They have different lengths of memory as well. So while like some people might see that, after 10 to 14 days of removing a food, they have like significant improvement. They don't have those kinds of reactions anymore. Others might, find that they reintroduce those foods later on down the road and still have a little bit of issues, or might have, like there's just different situations for different people, because sensitivities, it's also, these foods are dose dependent. So it might be that like you used to just have like a tiny bit of gluten or dairy or eggs or whatever it was that's causing your sensitivity, and you would have like a big reaction. Now it might be that like, oh, if I just have like a little bit of it here and there, I don't have any reaction. And that for you might feel like a huge success compared to where you were starting from. Whereas somebody else is like, I kind of suspect that maybe I have a little something going on, and it's like not that big of a deal, but I'm more of an optimizer. I really want to optimize my health. Yeah. And so they might more be working on going from like just a little bit of a reaction to no reaction at all. And that would be huge for them. So it depends on kind of where we're starting from, where we're trying to go, what your situation is. But the answer is it depends. You can probably, lessen your reactivity to these foods quite a bit, But for some people, you may have that sensitivity forever, just working on having it be a lower reaction, essentially.
Got it. So you're saying there's a chance. That's what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. There's a chance. So if you are dealing with sensitivities, if you have wondered about food sensitivity testing, I hope that this has been a helpful episode for you to get some clarity on these types of things. But like a lot of the things we talk about, it's definitely like a case-by-case basis. It's very much an it depends answer. So I definitely invite you, of course, to message me if you want to talk about your specific situation a little bit deeper. Always happy to chat with you guys. We love our podcast listeners. We appreciate you all. So anything we can do to help and give back, we're always happy to do so. But that is all for this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, share it with a friend, post it on your Instagram stories, spread the information. But we'll be back next week with another great episode.
Bye, you guys.